Field Marshal Robert Ritter von Greim was a German military officer whose life spanned a period of intense upheaval in Europe from the final years of the German Empire through the First World War, the rise and collapse of the Nazi regime, and the start of the post-war order. His career is often remembered for his long service as an aviator and military commander, but also for his late war association with Adolf Hitler and the final days of the Third Reich. Understanding his life requires looking at both his military accomplishments and the destructive political system he ultimately served. He was born in 1892 in Bayreuth, a town in Bavaria known for its strong regional military traditions. His family came from a modest background, and he chose the military as a stable career path. At 19, he entered an artillery regiment in the Bavarian army, a typical path for young men seeking upward mobility in the German Empire. When the First World War started in 1914, he deployed with his unit to the front, where he was quickly exposed to the intense challenges of modern warfare. Early in the war, he volunteered to transfer to the air service, which was still a relatively new branch. Aviation fascinated him, and the German military was beginning to value reconnaissance and fighter pilots more highly. By 1915, he had qualified as an observer, flying in two-seat aircraft whose primary mission was to collect intelligence. He later trained as a pilot, a role in which he found both skill and confidence. He became known as a determined and technically capable flyer, eventually achieving several aerial victories. Aviation in the First World War was extremely dangerous, and pilots faced mechanical failures, harsh weather, and combat with little protection. Many did not survive long. His service earned him several decorations, and he ended the war as a respected pilot, though far less famous than the major fighter aces of the era. After the German defeat in 1918, he, like many veterans, faced an uncertain future. The Treaty of Versailles restricted Germany's military forces, particularly its air arm, and left many former pilots without clear prospects. He tried to continue working in aviation by joining paramilitary groups and flying schools that operated in the gray zones of the post-war environment. Germany's new republic was politically unstable, and nationalist veterans often aligned themselves with right-wing movements that rejected the new democratic order. He continued flying and training pilots, and he also took part in the secret programs that helped Germany maintain aviation expertise despite treaty restrictions. These activities kept him connected to military circles during the 1920s. When the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, the new government rapidly rebuilt Germany's armed forces. The Luftwaffe, created in open violation of the Versailles Treaty, needed experienced pilots and officers, and he became one of many First World War veterans recruited to help shape it. He received steady promotions as the Air Force expanded and Germany accelerated its rearmament. He was valued for his experience and organizational discipline, more than personal charisma. While many officers in this period supported or cooperated with the Nazi regime, it is important to understand that their participation helped make large-scale militarization possible and ultimately contributed to the destructive wars Germany would soon initiate. During the Second World War, he held several important command positions. He oversaw Luftwaffe formations during the early campaigns and was involved in operational planning and command on the Eastern Front. The air war in the East was immense in scale and devastating in human consequences. Luftwaffe units supported ground offensives that caused enormous destruction, and the wider conflict, planned and directed by the Nazi leadership, resulted in widespread civilian suffering. His career advanced in this environment, and he earned a reputation for competence and loyalty within the military hierarchy. Yet by the middle of the war, the Luftwaffe was struggling with shortages of fuel, trained pilots, and modern aircraft. These problems stemmed from strategic miscalculations and the overwhelming industrial power of the Allied nations. He spent part of the war in various command and inspection roles, at times overseeing fighter units and operational training formations. As Germany's situation deteriorated, the Luftwaffe's high command became increasingly strained, both by losses in the field and by internal leadership problems. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had lost much of Hitler's confidence by 1945 due to military failures and political maneuvering. In this final chaotic stage of the war, Hitler sought loyal officers who he believed would stand with him as the regime collapsed. In April 1945, he was summoned to Hitler's bunker in Berlin, a dangerous mission that required flying through territory already dominated by Allied forces. He managed to reach the besieged city with Hanna Reitsch, a celebrated test pilot, in one of the last notable flights into Berlin before the Soviet army completed its encirclement. Hitler, angry with Göring and convinced that only absolute loyalty could hold the collapsing regime together, appointed him as the new commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. This appointment came at a time when the Air Force no longer had the ability to influence the outcome of the war. The designation made him the last person to hold that rank, but it carried little practical meaning as Germany's defeat was imminent. Hitler also promoted him to the rank of Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German military. In earlier years, this rank had been bestowed on officers who had achieved major victories or commanded large theaters of war. By April 1945, such promotions reflected desperation rather than achievement. His task, given by Hitler, was to attempt to break through Soviet lines, reach remaining German forces, and continue resistance. With the situation hopeless, he and Reitsch flew out of Berlin in one of the last departures before the city fell. His final orders from Hitler had no realistic chance of being carried out, and within days, Hitler was dead and the Nazi regime had collapsed. After escaping Berlin, he was captured by American forces in early May 1945. As a senior officer of the Nazi military, especially one appointed in the final days by Hitler himself, he was considered a potentially important source of information. However, he was also aware that Allied authorities were preparing to investigate and prosecute individuals connected to war crimes and aggressive war. Though no major charges had yet been formulated against him specifically, his position within the Luftwaffe and his association with the regime placed him under heavy suspicion. While in American custody, he became distressed, anxious about interrogation, and uncertain about his future. On May 24, 1945, shortly after being taken into detention in Austria, he took his own life by ingesting poison that he had managed to conceal. He died before he could be questioned in depth or brought before any tribunal. His suicide prevented the full examination of his wartime decisions and limited the historical record regarding his personal views and level of involvement in the policies of the Nazi state. In the decades following the war, his legacy has remained controversial and generally subdued, overshadowed by the wider crimes of the regime he served. He is sometimes mentioned in accounts of the last days of Hitler because of the dramatic circumstances under which he reached and left Berlin. However, his overall role in the Luftwaffe does not compare in scale to the major architects of Nazi military strategy. Historians typically discuss him as a competent but conventional officer whose loyalty led him to remain with the regime until its final collapse. His rise to the top position in the Luftwaffe was not the result of long-term leadership success, but rather the outcome of Hitler's fury at Göring and his desperate search for unconditional loyalty. Examining his life offers insight into the ways professional soldiers can become entwined with authoritarian systems. His early years show a conventional military path shaped by the nationalism and upheaval of early 20th century Europe. His interwar career reflects how Germany's clandestine rearmament and the political climate of the time allowed former officers to rebuild military institutions that later served Nazi ambitions. His wartime service demonstrates how technical skill and obedience, when placed within an aggressive and criminal political framework, become part of a destructive whole. Finally, his end illustrates the disintegration of that system and the personal despair faced by many who had tied their careers and identities to it. A biography of him must therefore acknowledge both his individual experiences as a pilot and commander and the larger context of the regime he supported.